Greetings, friends. My name is Paul Campbell, and I serve as music director at St. Thomas More Ordinariate Catholic Parish in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Recently, I was asked to give a couple of presentations at the first ever Ordinariate Musicians Conference at our Cathedral and Chancery in Houston, Texas. So what I decided to do is to create a pair of videos, one of each of those presentations. And the first of those I'm recording today is a survey of mass settings and minor propers for the Ordinariate liturgy. So this is for musicians planning music for the Ordinariate Mass and what options are available to us by way of mass settings and minor propers. We're going to start today looking at mass settings, and we're going to categorize these based on their stylistic composition. And so we're going to start with unison through composed settings in hieratic English with organ. This presentation is strictly about congregational settings of the ordinary of the Mass. Of course, there are many possibilities in terms of choral settings, but most ordinariate musicians find themselves in fairly humble circumstances in which they're looking more likely for unison settings led by a cantor or choir that can be sung by the full congregation. So we are starting with unison through composed settings in hieratic English, and by that I mean the elevated sacral English commonly used in the Ordinariate Mass. First of these, which will be familiar to most Ordinariate musicians, is the Healy-Willan Missa de Sancta Maria Magdalena, available in the 1940 hymnal and in the 1982. We're going to be looking at engravings that I've made for use in our worship aids here at St. Thomas More. So here is the Ordinary of the Mass by Healy-Willan. There is, I understand, a credo, though I don't believe it's in the 1940 or 82 hymnals, but you might be able to look that up as well if you're determined to sing the creed according to the same setting as the rest of the movements. Next, we have Martin Shaw's Anglican Folk Mass. And if you are not familiar with this setting, do not be put off by the terminology folk mass. By that is meant a congregational mass to be sung by the people. Next, we come to a setting that's perhaps less familiar and probably unknown to most ordinary musicians. And this is a very fine setting that I'd like to recommend to you. It's by the English composer Richard Sheppard, who just died a few years ago after a long connection, I believe, both with Salisbury Cathedral and with York Minster, called the Tisbury Service. This is available through St. James Music Press, which you can find easily by searching online. St. James Music Press, very briefly, is an online music publisher who, for a pretty modest, all things considered, annual subscription price, allows you to download and print any and all of their music to your heart's content. And so if you'd like to be able to reprint this setting, that's where you can find it. And you can also find there a recording of the Tisbury service. A few things worth mentioning. The first, just a caveat that all mass settings for our liturgy must be approved by our chancery, and this one is not yet approved. We've been using it here at St. Thomas More for years, but I've not until recently become aware of this requirement, and so I will be formally recommending this mass to our chancery and possibly even for our upcoming Ordinariate hymnal. Second, if it's any cause for concern, as you started to hear the Kyrie, we have Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. It starts to sound like the Novus Ordo, or in the Episcopal Church, Rite 2, because we don't hear have mercy upon us, but then you hear that it does indeed appear at the end of the third repetition. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy upon us. And so too for Christ have mercy and the final Lord have mercy. So the upon us there presumably applies to the other petitions as well, and so we do get in the proper use of the hieratic English that we would need in our ordinariate Mass. Next, we go to another piece probably less well known, and this is L.J. White's Communion Service in E flat. This is still being published, and so if you Google it online, you'll be able to get the sheet music for it with the organ accompaniment and the melody. And I've engraved it here again, a melody-only version for our congregation, where we do have a CCLI license to print melodies in our comprehensive worship aid. In our particular case, although we did take a crack at the Gloria for some time, we use this setting, the Kyrie, the Sanctus Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei in Advent. So this is our Advent setting in which we do not use the Gloria, but that's not to say you're not certainly capable of pulling off the Gloria with your own congregation. And we have a setting by Alfred Smith, who was an Episcopal priest for some time in the Philadelphia region and then out in California and then returned to the Philadelphia region. A copy was provided to me by a fellow ordinary musician from our community in the Washington, D.C. area. And it's a good setting. It's in G minor. That being said, we found, again, this is another one like the prior one in which we found the Gloria a little less than satisfactory. The Gloria here really stays relentlessly locked into G minor, and because it doesn't go anywhere harmonically, and because it's the longest and wordiest of the movements, we decided this is another one that would serve us well for one of our seasons in which we don't have the Gloria. And so we use the Kyrie, the Sanctus Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei as our Lenten setting. And the minor tonality does serve us very well, of course, for Lent. And also, the Kyrie, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei are singable by a choir in four-part harmony, and that's the way the original score is laid out. We use it in unison, but if you have a choir that would like to sing in four-part harmony, even as the congregation sings with the sopranos in unison, this is a good setting for that. Keeps things at about the right level for both your congregation and for those choir members that would like a bit more of a challenge. So there is our list of unison through composed settings in hieratic English with organ, the Willan, the Martin Shaw, Richard Shepard, L.J. White, and Alfred Smith. And in the session, we asked if anyone was aware of any other settings. Of course, the one that was immediately mentioned was the John Marbeck Book of Common Prayer noted setting. We've come to think of that as a through composed setting with organ, although, of course, originally it was more of a plain song setting. Very simple, one syllable to a note, as was required by the prayer book rubrics at the time. And so we're going to or lead off our next category of unison plain song settings in hieratic English with or without organ. So these are plain song settings in which, as I said, we're going to start with John Marbeck's Book of Common Prayer noted. This is probably another familiar setting to most ordinary musicians. I've laid it out here using modern chant notation. And you may notice we have two Agnus Deis. And in the Ordinariate, in Requiem Masses, we are required to have the petition, grant them rest, grant them rest, grant them rest everlasting at the end of each line of the Agnus Dei. And so I've arranged it, as well as arranged the organ part in our particular setting, to have an Agnus Dei option, which allows us to use this Mass setting for Requiem Masses, which we do pretty much exclusively because I've not rearranged any of our other settings to include those petitions there in the Agnus Dei. But this gives us that option. There is a credo as well. As I said, here at St. Thomas More, we say the credo, and so I've not included that here in the engraving, but you're probably well familiar with this setting in your own circumstances. Then we have some more florid settings, which have their roots in more florid. Of course, Gregorian chant. These would have been Latin settings, later rearranged into English. And you can see, especially looking at the Kyrie, that the Missa de Angelis, one of the settings in the 1940 and 82 hymnals, is indeed a more melismatic setting. And so this is a look at the Missa de Angelis. As you can see, for the first time, I'm showing a credo here. Again, we say our creed here at St. Thomas More, but I had occasion to engrave this setting for another congregation in our Ordinariate. And so you see the credo there. And so this is a Gregorian chant setting, but with our familiar English. And there is part 2, the remainder of the credo and the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei. So that's the Missa de Angelis. And next we have the Missa Marialis. This is another Gregorian chant setting that you're going to find in the 1940 and 82 hymnals, similar to the Missa de Angelis. Again, a more melismatic setting that has been put to our English text. It looks like I did not have occasion here to set the Gloria. So you see the other movements, including the Credo, but without the Gloria in this case. But of course, there is a Gloria. As you might guess from the title, Missa Marialis, and this has a long association with Marian feasts, feasts of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so it's certainly appropriate on those occasions. It's certainly appropriate to be used at any time. Nobody will look askance at you for using the Missa Marialis on other occasions. But that's another Gregorian chant setting, since reworded to English. Next, we have Masses of the St. Dunstan Kyrielle. This was a large work by Charles Winfred Douglas, who was the major force behind the hymnal 1940 and an Episcopal priest. And as you can see, well before 1940 and 1933, he had taken all of the Gregorian Mass settings that you find there on the table of contents and reset them to English. And that's the purpose of the sample page on the right there, is just to see that these are indeed in English in this publication, the St. Dunstan Kyrielle, and you can find it online at the link that I've put there, thanks to the Church Music Association of America. So you have many more options there for Gregorian Masses set to English. Of course, there's probably a limit to your congregation's skill to sing many or even one of these more melismatic Gregorian settings. And so that's just a caution there. If your congregation tends to prefer a choral setting and you have a good choir capable of this kind of music, then you could certainly go that direction and sing multiple Gregorian Masses throughout the year. But these are going to be a little tougher for congregations to handle, being as melismatic as they are. Back to the table of contents, you do see already included here in the St. Dunstan Kyrielle are the Missa Marialis, the Missa de Angelis, and Marbec's communion service, a few of the ones we've already looked at. And then a few credo settings down below as well from the De Angelis and the John Marbec. So that rounds out our collection of unison plain song settings with or without organ. And that means we're going to move on now to Latin settings. So these are unison plain song settings in Latin with or without organ. First, we should mention right away two of the settings we've already looked at, which began as Latin settings and then were set to English, the Missa de Angelis and the Missa Marialis. And of course, we could go back very easily, if we know those masses already in English, to their original Latin counterpoints. And so here's just a couple of editions I found online that show those settings, both to modern and to Neume notation in the original Greek and Latin. And then, somewhat similar to the St. Dunstan Kyrielle, are all of the Masses 1 through 18 of the Kyriale, which again, thanks to musicasacra.com, are all available online as well. Okay, so you can see that these are in neumes, in older Gregorian notation, and are exclusively in that format in this particular publication. But again, many Gregorian chant options that you would have for Mass settings in Latin in their original language and setting. Next, we go to a fairly unique category, and those are unison through composed settings in Latin with organ. So these would be similar to the Willen and the other settings that we started with, being through composed works, unison settings with organ, but not chant settings, but through composed, and but in Latin rather than English. Okay, so we're going to start now with another work of Healy Willen. This is his Mass of St. Teresa. And this is a lovely, very singable, very diatonic Latin unison Mass setting that could be sung by choir, or if your congregation is ready to attempt it in Latin, by your congregation. And so here we get a look at the engraving I've done of this setting. And you can see the translations are out there on the right-hand side. Well, where can you find the accompaniment for this? And happily, it's online. This was published in 1958 in the New St. Basil Hymnal, a Catholic hymnal of the time. It was I believe, commissioned and written for that hymnal, and that hymnal's online at Scribed. So you see the link here. Look for the New St. Basil Hymnal 1958. It appears in print on page 227, as you can see, but at the top I've included the page count of the PDF just to show that it begins on page 278. And as you can see, includes the organ accompaniment as well as the voices. So that can be your source for your accompaniment if you'd like to try this with your choir and your congregation. Another through composed setting in Latin with organ is the Short Mass in C by Richard Runcianteri. And he was the organist choir master of Westminster Cathedral in London at about the first half of the 20th century. Very influential figure in English Catholic Church music at the time, so very much right up our alley as far as our patrimony goes. It's a little bit dated given the time that it was written, but nonetheless a worthy setting in unison, singable by a congregation, and you can find it on the Choral Public Domain Library. So you see the link here, and so you can print your music, including the organ accompaniment, from there for free and without concern for copyright law. And I've not done an engraving of this setting because we've never sung it here at St. Thomas More, but it is an option that's available to you. I'm aware that there is a Mass of St. Peter by Healy Willen, similar to the Mass of St. Teresa, again, unison through composed with organ in Latin, but I've never laid eyes on it, and we had another conference attendee who approached the Healy Willen Society and was able to obtain a copy from them. And I'll look forward to obtaining a copy from him. So I don't yet have a copy to share with you, but it is out there and available. And we'll have to look into what matters of copyright law would allow us to print it and use it in our masses, but it's definitely worth mentioning. If it's anything like the Mass of St. Teresa, it's certainly a worthy setting for you to consider singing with your congregation in Latin. Once we have done our survey of Mass settings, then we have to consider how we're going to schedule these in our parish liturgies. So we have a few options there. Certainly, if you're starting out and if you're in fairly modest circumstances, you could certainly be singing the same Mass setting for every Mass, every Sunday and Holy Day, or however often it is that you have music, organ or choir, or cantor, and so forth at your Mass. So you could be doing the same setting every time, but even this has a couple of options within this category. You could do one set of pick and choose movements by two or more composers. I know growing up it was common for us to sing the shorter movements of perhaps Marbeck or Willan, but for the Gloria to go a simpler direction by chanting the Old Scottish Gloria, so called. So we'd insert other movements. There's no reason, of course, that you couldn't sing a fairly eclectic mass, each movement by a different composer. Although I'd have to say this is less favorable these days, and we ought, I think, to set a goal for ourselves of having a common thread throughout the Mass of Mass settings, all composed by the same composer. But if you're in modest circumstances and need to begin somewhere, the simplest of options from each Mass setting might allow you to get on your feet. And then, of course, there's the option I've just mentioned as being perhaps a little more desirable, and that's one complete setting by a single composer. So you might have Willan every Sunday, but all the movements by Willan. You might have Marbeck every Sunday, but all the movements by Marbeck. Oftentimes these are coupled with perhaps a credo by another composer, either from the Missa de Angelis or the Missa Marialis, or Marbeck. Even if you're singing Willan, you might sing the Marbeck credo. There's a number of options there, but the credo, being the longest and wordiest movement, does tend to be set aside as the one that might be from a different setting and is also sung the same every week, since it's difficult to tackle learning a whole new credo setting for every new Mass setting that you might learn. You could also, once you have two settings under your belt, rotate them seasonally. So you might, of course, fall is not a liturgical season, but most of them up here are. You might, starting in the fall, sing, for example, Willan, and then in Advent go over to Marbeck, and then back to Willan for Christmas and Epiphany, back to Marbeck for Lent, and just alternate between the two, but by fairly substantial chunks of time throughout the year. So that's certainly an option. You could also have two or more settings rotating weekly. So this would be more like an alternation if you just have two settings, such as Willan one week, Marbeck the next, Willan one week, Marbeck the next. Or, of course, I'm mentioning those two as the best known to most of us, although we've already looked at many different options that we could be rotating or alternating weekly. Or you could have a combination of weekly and seasonal rotation, and that's the pattern that we've fallen into here, really, at St. Thomas More Parish. So we'll look at what we do here. As I mentioned, we have two settings for Advent and Lent, one apiece, in which we've omitted the Gloria. So in Advent, we sing the White Communion Service in E flat, and in Lent, the Smith Missa de Sancto Lucano. And those suit us well. The Glorias and both had various reasons why they were perhaps a little less desirable, but they work very well for us for a limited period of time for those two seasons without the Gloria. But for the remainder of the year, excepting Advent and Lent, we do rotate weekly through three different settings, and those are the Marbeck, the Willan, and the Shepherd Tisbury service that we looked at and listened to. And so most of the time, if you come to Sunday Mass at St. Thomas More and the Holy Days and so forth, you're going to experience a rotation every week through those three. 4 might be a bit much, but 3 seems to work well for us, and then using those other two in Advent and Lent. At the same time, we have a fairly simple sung Mass at 7 p.m. on Sundays, kind of a last chance Mass, in which we get a mix of our own parishioners, but also being a last chance Mass, a last opportunity for Catholics of conscience to go to Mass on a Sunday for their obligation before Sunday is over. We get a decent mix of other people from other parishes who know of this Mass, and if they've missed all the other opportunities during the day, they'll come to ours. So on both counts, this Mass requires simpler music and something that'll be easier for folks to grasp. We also try to keep it to an hour. We do sing fewer stanzas of the hymns at this Mass. And so the Marbeck is sung there every week, all year long, just adding and subtracting the Gloria at the appropriate seasons. Now we begin our next major topic for this presentation, and that is our survey of minor propers for the Ordinariate liturgy. The minor propers are the portions of the Mass, such as the introit, the gradual, the Alleluia verse, the communion, the offertory, which are sung or chanted at various portions during the Mass. And so we're going to review our options for those being chanted. These are much more commonly sung by a cantor or choir rather than by the whole congregation. So whereas we looked at congregational Mass settings, these minor propers are much more often sung by a choir or a cantor. The text that we're looking at in front of us now is from the rubrical directory about our Ordinariate Mass that appears in our Missal. And so we read there, the given text of the chants may be replaced by the chants of the Graduale Romanum or by musical settings of the Graduale, which rely on a different translation of the same texts. And I put that there just to say that we are looking at hieratic English settings, excuse me, but as stated in our own rubrics, we are not limited to these. And if there's some reason you wanted to use, for instance, the simple English propers, which would be in more modern settings and perhaps even simpler than the ones we're going to look at, there's nothing stopping you from doing that that I'm aware of, because different translations of the same texts may be used. And so just to point that out from the start. But we're today going to limit our consideration to those settings in hieratic English, which will exactly match or very closely match our own Missal. I'm presenting these in chronological order of their publication, and so we start with the English Gradual of 1933, published for Anglo-Catholics in England at the time. But I'm not going to elaborate much on it because this is essentially the same volume as the Anglican Use Gradual we're going to look at in just a moment. But that was the first published with these kinds of resources available to Anglo-Catholics in England. Next, we get the Plain Chant Gradual, edited by Palmer and Burgess. There was a first edition in 1946 and the most recent edition, 1965. There are links there where you can find the entire, or really 4-volume work, 1 and 2 grouped together and 3 and 4 grouped together. And so we see a couple of examples on our page. As you can see, these are again very melismatic, florid settings in Gregorian chant with Gregorian notation of the minor propers. And so these can go on at some length and require a very good choir in order to do them, at least if you're going to do them every week. Some might elect to do them, say, on very high holy days like Christmas and Easter, and otherwise to use simpler resources we'll be looking at. But in any event, if you've got a choir up to the task and you don't mind your Mass being quite long because of the length some of these will add to the Mass, you could certainly call upon this resource. Then in 2006, we got the Anglican Use Gradual First Edition, edited by David Burt. And the whole thing is now available online. And so you see the link there. This is a volume that had a black cover. And I've provided the first page there just so you can see the notation style. And these are the texts of our minor propers, but set to much simpler tones than you're going to find in the Palmer and Burgess Plain Chant Gradual. And moreover, they're set to the same tone every week. And so they're much more accessible to choirs in more humble circumstances. So here we have the introit, and you're going to find the introit every week set to the same music, just the words changing. And likewise with the gradual, the Alleluia, the offertory, and the communion. So this makes them accessible because once a choir gets those tones into their ears and voices, it's pretty easy for them, even if they've never sung Gregorian notation before, to neumes, to be able to look at the page and pick up on where to sing the right notes. Now, it's very important to note that the first edition of the Anglican Use Gradual has many Sundays in it which no longer align with the proper texts on the Sundays of our Missal. Divine Worship, the Missal, came out subsequent to the first edition of the Anglican Use Gradual. And so especially on the Sundays after Trinity, what are often called ordinary time, these kinds of occasions, they might be off by a week. And so one cannot simply page to, say, the 22nd Sunday after Trinity or the 22nd Sunday in ordinary time in the Anglican Use Gradual First Edition, chant those chants and be guaranteed that they're going to line up with the same Sunday in the Missal. The likelihood is that they will not. But the reason that I've provided as our third image on this slide, the index of chants, is just to show that at the end of the book, there is an index, an alphabetical index of all the introits, all the graduals, etc., for all the different minor propers. And as long as you're looking up the Latin incipit of the chant that you want, so you go to a particular Sunday in our Missal and you look for the chants that you're looking for, and you look them up here in the first edition, you'll likely find them, and then you can put together your own set of propers that do align with our Missal, even though in the book they're not necessarily going to align with the proper Sunday. So the music is there to be able to do this, but you can't just accept wholesale any particular Sunday as having all the right chants on it. You've got to find each chant individually and put together your own resource for your choir to chant from. Then in 2018, we got the St. Peter Gradual. This was edited by Monsignor Carl Reed, who in rapid succession was an ordinariate priest, and then the dean of the Canadian deanery of the Ordinariate, and then was tapped to become the ordinary of the Australian Ordinariate, the Ordinariate of Our Lady of the Southern Cross. And so this is a volume that he put together. Like the Anglican Use Gradual before it, and I should have mentioned this, and it's the reason here that I put the complete table of contents, is that here we're only seeing Sundays and some solemnities. And so this is not a book, and neither is the Anglican Use Gradual First Edition, that gives you the ability to chant the propers on every single weekday. Those resources are not there. And so some other things to note about this particular volume is that it is in modern notation, looking at the image on the right. And it's a style of modern notation, largely in eighth notes, that includes lots of stems and beams on the page. This just personally is not a form of modern chant notation that I prefer. I'd much prefer to see what we get in, say, the 1982 hymnal, where we only get the note heads without all the stems and beams on the page. But in any event, this is still certainly a perfectly acceptable form of modern notation for chant. These are the same tones that you're going to find in the Anglican Use Gradual. So again, these are simpler psalm tones used for chanting the texts of our minor propers for each of the Sundays and solemnities. And so that's a look at the St. Peter Gradual. Most recently, David Burt, who edited the first edition of the Anglican Use Gradual, has produced a second edition. And there are two things to note about the second edition. First is that it does now have all the Sundays aligning, and weekdays for that matter, aligning with the text of our missal. And so you no longer have to worry about going to a particular Sunday and wondering whether those propers are going to line up with what's in the missal. It's now been released in a form that fully lines up. For that matter, also every weekday Mass, every Saints' Day Mass. This is quite a thick edition, and that's why I included, for just as an example, on the right, Ember Wednesday in September. You'd never see a heading like that in either the first edition or in the St. Peter Gradual, but you have the ability with the Anglican Use Gradual second edition to chant the propers for any day in the Ordinariate of the entire church year. This, as you can see, has a white cover on the left there as opposed to the black cover of the first edition. I will say just a couple of downsides. First of all, there are some musical errors, matters of music and text underlay and so forth. These are easy enough to fix and figure out, but David Burt, I'm aware, is compiling a list of the errata so we can be aware of the errors we're going to encounter in this volume. Also, the binding is fairly poor. And this has its minuses and its pluses. So if your choir uses these books for any length of time, they're going to start falling apart. The pages are going to start falling out. It's just a glued binding. On the upside, that means it's quite easy to bend the spine of this volume back on itself and just pull each page out and scan for your choir sets of minor propers that they can then use any given Sunday. I'm not advising that you go around copyright law by buying one copy and cannibalizing it for making multiple copies for your choir. Please do contribute to this effort by purchasing enough for your choir, but once you do, you might well find that they will start to fall apart, at which point it might be handier for you to begin pulling pages and running scans or copies that your choir can sing from. So here's our list that we went through, okay, but that certainly gives us plenty to work with in terms of the minor propers. Now, there are related issues concerning the minor propers that we have to consider. First, frankly, is whether we need to use them at all. This, again, is a quote from the Rubrical Directory of Divine Worship, the Missal, and here we find in the underlined portions, the gradual and Alleluia may be replaced by the responsorial psalm and Alleluia of the lectionary. Then, in place of the introit, offertory, and communion, an appropriate hymn may also be sung. So when you put all these options together, what you find is that as long as you are chanting the psalm from the lectionary, and you're singing the Alleluia verse from the lectionary, and you're singing hymns in place of the other three movements, it's not technically necessary to be singing the minor propers as provided in the missal at all. And that would be unusual in an ordinariate community. But at the same time, if you're starting a very small community and very modest circumstances and want to sing hymns and chant the psalm and just sing the Alleluia verse that's in the lectionary, all those things will cover the bases. You're not required to sing precisely the texts that you find in Divine Worship, the Missal, for all of the minor propers, as long as you're replacing them with those other items. Next is the question of whether to sing the gradual or to chant the psalm. So the gradual is a pair of psalm verses, typically between the Old Testament and epistle lessons, but we could use the psalm text as well that's appointed in the lectionary. Just an example of what we do here at St. Thomas More, we do some of both. For the most part, though, your experience as a regular worshiper on Sundays and feast days, holy days, when we have our choir and organ and music, is going to be the psalm. So the psalm is chanted by the choir and congregation together at all Sunday and holy day masses, We use the Coverdale translation, patrimonial to our diocese, with verses equivalent to the lectionary responsorial psalm. So we do not use verbatim the psalm text right from the lectionary. We use the equivalent verses from the Coverdale translation. Now note my asterisk there. We're going to come back to that in a moment. At the same time, in simpler masses, like on weekdays when we have, if we have masses that have music, or at our 7 p.m. last chance mass, instead that's chanted, that we have the gradual chanted by the choir or a cantor. Okay, so in those cases, when things are a bit simpler, we chant the gradual. And of course, the gradual can simply be recited, spoken by the celebrant when it's just a said Mass, when there's no music at that weekday Mass. As to the asterisk, we do have to be careful. I've discovered over the years that the Coverdale verse numbering is not always the same as the lectionary verse numbering. In other words, if the RSV lectionary book is telling you that on a given Sunday we're going to sing Psalm 85, verses 2 through 8, and you go to Coverdale, that it may in the Coverdale be verses 3 through 9 or 3 through 10. So the groupings of the verses and the texts are going to be different. Now, I'm not saying that's the case in that particular case. I'm just making that up to make the point. But psalm numberings, the verse numberings can be different in Coverdale than they are in the lectionary book. The point being that what we must be chanting are the equivalent texts, not the equivalent verse numbers. So be careful if you're going to use the Coverdale psalms, which is very desirable in our particular movement. That you're going to use the equivalent texts and not simply take it for granted that the verse numbers are going to be the same in both cases. If we decide to chant psalms, we have a small sidebar here on our options for chanting the psalms. There are, of course, the plain song psalm tones, and these are the simplest option, certainly, and they can be done unaccompanied, led by a cantor and choir, joined by a congregation. All of those are options. Sort of at the opposite end of the difficulty spectrum is full Anglican chant. So those are taking the full or half Anglican chants that you might hear normally at evensong, which is a fairly long series of chord changes and a fairly complicated system of pointing the texts, complicated at least as far as congregations go in terms of chanting the full verses of the Psalms to full Anglican chant. But there is, to my mind, a happy medium which is best suited to congregations. This may be controversial to some, but I do personally believe that full Anglican chant is best left to a choir, that it requires enough training and nuance that there's a vastly diminishing return in attempting to get your congregation to sing a full Anglican chant. So we're best served, I think, by using the simplified Anglican chant that we are about to show you here. So where to find these? The Hymnal 1982 does have a page of these, only in the organist edition, the spiral-bound organist edition, and it's the service music edition because there are two separate volumes for the hymns and for all the other service music. So you see the numbers here, S408 through S415, and those dark lines bracketing the top and the bottom of the page indicate that these can be freely copied for congregational use. We use several of these. As you can see, these use far fewer chord changes than regular full or even half Anglican chant. And they're also designed to be sung in unison with the organ accompanying the harmonies that you see here. Also, St. James Music Press, which I've mentioned before as the publisher of Richard Shepherd's Tisbury service, publishes two collections of these. one on the right, and then another one, the pair on the left by William Bradley Roberts. As you can see, in both cases, these are based on hymns, on hymn tunes. And at St. Thomas More, it is our practice, whenever we sing any of these hymn tunes available to us in either of these volumes, we will sing the psalm that day to the simplified Anglican chant that's based on that hymn tune that we've sung or will be singing the self-same day. If that is not one of the options of the hymns that we're singing that day, we fall back on about 4 of the others from the hymnal 1982. Here's how it looks in our worship aid. This is as you can see, I've only provided the unison tone for Psalm 98, 1 through 5 in this case. And we've based it, we're using the tune, which I'm told in Welsh is pronounced Hyfrydol, but many of us might call Hyfrydol. And so it works like this. I'm going to learn the tone first by counting up to 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you can hear those notes are based on love divine, all loves excelling. Simplified. So we simply sing with the pointing, which now requires only one chord change per line. O sing unto the Lord a new song, for he hath done marvelous things. With his own right hand and with his holy arm hath he gotten himself the victory. And so forth. This, of course, is accompanied by organ and 4-part harmony. And if your choir cares to sing in 4-part harmony, as some of our members do, you can provide the harmonized version for them, even as your congregation is largely chanting in unison, as provided here in our worship aid. Then we come to the Alleluia, which can be sung in plain song in the setting provided in the various minor propers gradual books that we've already looked at. This is the setting that tends to be provided throughout. Hallelujah, hallelujah. And as you can hear, as we all come in on the second Alleluia, that's quite melismatic and probably a little difficult for congregations to pull off effectively. Perhaps they can pull it off, but how effectively may be another question. So I have never favored using this setting in our Mass here at St. Thomas More. We get this simpler Gregorian setting, which will be familiar to most ears. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah. So this is the setting that we tend to use at weekday masses unaccompanied, as well as our 7 p.m. Sunday Mass, a simpler sung Mass. We tend to fall back on this setting instead of the more florid one above, just a bit easier for congregations to sing. Finally, on Sunday mornings and solemnities and feast days and so forth, we use a more through composed setting, and this is drawn in this case from the Palestrina hymn tune Victory, which you will know from Eastertide as the strife is o'er, the battle done. So we get the downbeat pedal note D there, bum, hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. So that's sung first by our trebles and then by the full choir and congregation, both before and after the verse. And so in our particular setting, we desired a more celebratory, splashier Alleluia than either of the plain song options would give us. And so that is quite a full accompaniment when we have the full congregation roaring in on the Alleluia set to that extraction from a hymn tune. I've also seen this done to O Filii et Filiae, Hallelujah, 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 and probably other options from which you can extract the Alleluia to a fuller and accompanied setting than you need find in either of the plain song settings you see above. And now we arrive also at the question of the sequences, whether to sing them to plain song or to strophic hymn tunes. In my setting, personally, I find congregations have a much easier time, especially on a hymn that only rolls around once a year, with strophic rhyming hymn tunes rather than some of the original plain song options. So to look at our first option, of course, from Easter, is the Victime Pascali. But if you can just tell looking on the left side at the original plain song that we have different verses set to different music. We have quite a roadmap sending us back and forth to different verses. We have men and women singing different verses based on sort of playing the roles of the angel and Mary and so forth. It's all wonderful, of course, but maybe a little bit difficult, especially when done only once a year for a congregation to pull off properly. And so certainly your choir could sing it alone. Here, I'd love to keep our congregation singing just as much as we can. And so here we sing on the right a strophic hymn on the same original source, a different translation, and specifically a different translation is what our missal does allow for many of these texts. Okay, so we get Christ the Lord is risen today. Christians, haste your vows to pay. Offer ye your praises meet at the Paschal Victim's feet, and so forth. My apologies, by the way, to those of you with perfect pitch. I know I'm nowhere near, but just to give us some sense that this is a strophic hymn, for lack of a better way that our congregations might think of it. You can tap your toe to it. It has a rhythm, it has a rhyme, and works quite well for us in our setting. Likewise, a little bit later, we come to Pentecost, and we have the Veni Sancte Spiritus. On the left, once again, we've got a bit of a roadmap with repeating 1A and 1B, then moving on to entirely new music for 2A and 2B and so forth all the way through for this sequence. Whereas on the right, we have, and I believe this is the text as provided in our missal, and we have to the web hymn tune, Come thou holy Paraclete, and from thy celestial seat send thy light and brilliancy, and so forth for the rest of it. Again, more accessible to my congregation at least, and therefore tends to be a more celebratory moment in the Mass rather than trying to mumble through the Gregorian chant version. Then we arrive at Corpus Christi. My first image there, and that's from our missal here, it says it may be sung or said, so unlike Easter or Pentecost, the sequence on Corpus Christi is optional. And as is stated for the other sequences, it says the text given here may be replaced by a prose or musical setting which relies on a different translation of the same sequence. Now, down below it is a quote from our RSV Catholic Edition lectionary book about the Corpus Christi sequence. And it says it's optional, as we've already learned, but then it also says the sequence may be used either in its entirety or in the shorter form, beginning with the words, in English at least, or in the prose version, lo the angel's food, the poetic version, lo the angel's food. And so putting those two options together, I've been able to compose on the right there a rhyming text. On the left is the minimal text of this sequence, which is much, much longer, but these are the last couple of verses which, if you're going to use it, are the minimal ones that are required. And I noticed just in reading it through that it fit quite well to Schmucke dich, deck thyself, my soul, with gladness, except for some cases when I had to rewrite and rearrange the words so that it would form a rhyme with that hymn tune. So here we get, lo, the angel's food is given to the pilgrim who hath striven. Okay, not much change at all to the original text. It's later on in the hymn where you find I've had to do some rewriting to get a translation of the same text. So that brings us to the end of this presentation. I do hope this has been a helpful resource for you, and feel free to contact me if you'd like any further questions or resources discussing these topics. Thank you very much, and God bless.